I tend to use the term internalized racism to represent the experience of people of color who have internalized the racism from society. Essentially, what that means is that the proponents of racism and all the variety of ways in which it's exacted speak to or insist upon the inferiority of people of color. And so when you've internalized that, that means that you have internalized to some degree that you are inferior. As a marginalized, subjugated person, your character, your integrity is under attack. So the last thing you want to do is to acknowledge that, in fact, you have internalized some of that, because that just makes you more vulnerable. But as part of the healing, it needs to come up, it needs to come out. But it can only happen in a safe place. So that is where a within group process, and by within group what I mean is with people who share the same identity, whether that's the same race or same class, are together to be able to talk without worrying about feeling that you are now sharing a vulnerability with people who have benefited from your oppression. But you can find now that Black people are much more comfortable in talking about skin color and the ways in which lighter skin is often privileged in the Black community as well as in the white community. And that's because I think some of the shame of that has been healed. And that as that shame gets healed, people are freer to talk about it because they're not feeling that shame about that anymore. It's as if the more you can begin to talk about the ways in which you have been wounded by racism, the more you're able to understand and really feel clear that that shame is not yours. It doesn't belong to you. That what has happened and what is happening is shameful.
And then, so I know different groups exhibit internalized oppression in different ways. Can you give us an example of how specific marginalized groups exhibit internalized oppression?
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned earlier, many groups, many racial and ethnic minority groups who tend to have darker skin complexions, many of them will use skin whitening creams or bleach to kind of lighten their darker complexion. In the Philippines, the group that I am a part of, my cultural group, it's also very common there to have skin whitening clinics. So it's actually quite abundant. It's everywhere. And so people are very willing to spend their hard-earned money to pay doctors to whiten their skin. So the skin whitening clinics are all over the Philippines. Children in the Philippines, the Philippines is a tropical country. The sun is out most of the day, all year round. But yet children growing up in the Philippines are socialized by their parents and by their elders to stay away from the sun so that they don't get too dark. Because again, dark skin has been associated with attractiveness and beauty. Other groups might deny, for example, or hide their true identity because they feel shame about it or they feel embarrassed about it. For instance, in the book, people talk about the chapter about the LGBT community in the book. People talk about, trying to pass as a straight person. So that they will not be discriminated against, so that they will not be treated any differently, and so forth. So having that need to have to hide who you really are or to deny who you really are is another example of internalized oppression.
As a biracial Asian white woman, I was in my 30s before I realized I had internalized anti-Asian ideas. I saw myself as less than because I wasn't fully white. And I made a lifetime of decisions based on that lie, including upholding racist ideas. Living in a world where whiteness is the standard for what's normal, what's desirable, what's good, and constantly being found lacking because we're not white, it takes a toll. There's a chronic psychological stress, and it builds up over lifetimes, over generations. And so consciously and or unconsciously, We seek to alleviate or eradicate that stress. It's a normal human response. It's a survival skill. In a way, I think internalizing racism is a way to cope. So internalizing racism looks like adopting those racist beliefs, believing that they are true about us, and supporting racist policies and becoming active participants in our own racial oppression. The BIPOC guide is needed because we need to do this work for ourselves. We have got to learn how to recognize and undo internalized racism when it shows up in us, when it shows up in the systems we're participating in. Only then are we going to effectively participate in creating a world where we can embrace the humanity of all.
I think the internalized racism is harder to get to, though, because it's not something that the individual can see. I have a friend who has a PhD and who's very intelligent and is, in a very high position. She's black. She grew up in a white part of Canada, so all her friends were white. All the institutions in which she went to school were dominated by white people. She only recently came to the realization that she had unconscious bias against black people. Now, this is at a very much later stage in her life. And as someone who is very highly educated and who has achieved a lot in their life, how do you get a grip of that? How do you deal with that personally when you realize that even though you self-identify as black, that you've unconsciously held biases against black people? And that's not uncommon. There's a movie coming out called, I believe it's called Farming. It's about a Nigerian boy who's farmed out by his family to the UK and brought up by working class white British people. He grew up but to be the leader of a neo-Nazi gang. So he hated non-white people. But by the time he joined this gang, that's
this
because
is a documentary?
It's a movie based on a real life
like a
experience.
docudrama.
Yeah,
Right.
and the director is the actual person who went
Wow.
through this. And these cases might seem far and few between, but they're not. They're actually, to a different minute degree, we all have internalized certain assumptions about ourselves based upon the color of our skin, which we feel is a problem in some way, and it's not.
Let me ask you, though, I want to pick up on a point that you said. Can we unlearn this behavior? Can we change ourselves to expose our own unconscious bias, but also unlearn this internalized form of racism? Girish?
Of course we can.
How?
We have to come to the realization first that we hold unconscious bias, but not just use it as a way to then carry on as if life was like it was before. We have to also unlearn it in a way that is very uncomfortable. It's not going to be a comfortable experience. It forces you to see that not only that you're not perfect, but that you've actually been hating on and hating people who look like you or who are like you for the very fact that you see yourself as being better than them based upon the standards of others who have always viewed you as being inferior. We start to read about it. There's an unconscious bias test online that you can take, and it just shows you whether or not you have, how much unconscious bias you have towards people of color. Classification of how we are separate from each other in some way. So the idea of group belonging or groupthink is there, but then at the same time, race is a more recent construction, and internalized racism is actually so subconscious, and so it happens so unconsciously that it actually affects us in ways that we don't actually realize. So the impact of unconscious racism or internalized racism has long-lasting effects in people in the way that they see themselves according to the values that have been prescribed by a dominant culture or a dominant group. So it's not just about whiteness. The dominant group could be a non-white group who set the values in terms of all the conditions in which one would be valued more. Well, you think about how standards of beauty and skin whitening creams in South Asia, in Africa. So I work in Ghana. I'm of South Asian background. I grew up in Singapore. And in all these places, you find that the shades of one's brownness, the shades of one's blackness, the shades of one's skin matter. At the same time, you have skin whitening creams and ideas of fairness, which are standards of so-called beauty, of which without you cannot afford to be called beautiful or get a good job or get married and so on, you have the ideas of beauty which apply to places in Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia where whiteness is seen to be the highest standard of beauty.